controversial speakers being disinvited from colleges and universities, governments trying to limit what's said in the classroom and public square. Today, free speech is under attack across the globe. But these problems have a deep history, especially on college campuses, where free speech is an essential part of university culture. Many universities are committed to free expression, but the University of Chicago's decision 130 years ago to make free expression central to its mission was bold for the time. It wasn't a discovery, but a commitment that has made groundbreaking discoveries possible. Today, this founding mission remains intact, providing inspiration far beyond UChicago's campus. Welcome to The Day Tomorrow Began, the genesis of world-changing ideas from the University of Chicago. In 1890, the University of Chicago was founded on the belief that an empowering education must be rooted in the principles of free expression. Without this kind of academic freedom, scholars' ideas and discoveries might never come to light, and students would be deprived of the opportunity to debate people and ideas they disagree with. The university's first president, William Rainey Harper, said the principle of free speech was fundamental to UChicago and could neither now nor at any future time be called in question. Each generation at UChicago has faced tests to this commitment. From being accused of fostering communism in the 1930s and 40s, to protecting the expression of all individual viewpoints during the Vietnam years, the university has steadfastly defended the rights of its students, faculty, and community members to express their opinions, no matter how unpopular. It also has emphasized that sustaining a culture of free expression requires welcoming diverse perspectives and backgrounds. In response to a number of campuses disinviting speakers for their unpopular views, UChicago faculty members drafted the Chicago Principles, a document confirming that debate could not be shut down if some people found ideas to be offensive, unwise, immoral, or wrong-headed. It became a beacon for others to follow, with more than 100 colleges and universities now having adopted the Chicago Principles. Today, UChicago's commitment to free expression is as strong as it was at its founding in 1890. The newly launched University of Chicago Forum for Free Inquiry and Expression is a groundbreaking effort that aims to promote, protect, and advocate for the advancement of free expression, and further establish UChicago as a global leader in safeguarding this vital academic priority. To learn more about this and other world-changing ideas, visit uchicago.edu/thedaytomorrowbegan.
Good morning. Many thanks to our colleagues in the communications department here for putting that together and for setting the tone for us today. For those that I have not yet had the chance to meet, my name is Tony Banut. I'm the Executive Director of the Chicago Forum on Free Inquiry and Expression. As you heard a little bit, and for those of you who were with us yesterday, our mission is really simple. It is to promote the understanding, the practice, and the advancement of open and free discourse here at the University of Chicago and beyond. And before I introduce my colleague who will moderate this opening panel today, I wanted to say just a few words about some programs that we are launching and that I would encourage those interested in learning more about to check out on our beautiful new website, which I can take no credit for making beautiful, but I'm delighted it's launched, the chicagoforum.uchicago.edu. So first, we are, for the University of Chicago community, we have set aside resources to support deeper inquiry around the practices and understanding of free inquiry and expression. That takes two shapes. If you are a faculty member here of any rank or a PhD student, we have research grants available for you. We've made the process for submitting ideas and applications very simple. We hope to close that in mid-November, November 15th. So please take a look and don't be shy about contacting us if you have questions and we want to hear your ideas. If you are a student here at any level, we are making what we're calling conversation grants available to you. And we want to promote the practice of free inquiry and expression by supporting students who have ideas for connecting across ideological difference and interrogating ideas in creative ways. Very simple application process. Take a look. Contact us if you have more questions. The At U Chicago and Beyond of our mission, the Beyond clause, I want to speak to just a little bit. So we are interested in partnering in a collaborative way with various sectors in American society that we think are particularly strategic and important for the practices of free inquiry and expression. And one of those is middle and high school education. We happen to have the benefit of a John Dewey founded laboratory school here on campus with phenomenal leadership that we are partnering with this year to develop a set of best practices and guidance for developmentally appropriate ways to enculturate and sustain free inquiry and expression in the middle and high school years. We are confident that at the tail end of this academic year, that will be instructive for other middle and high schools, and we are interested in being a host to that conversation and helping to make that happen. In a very organic and natural way, we have had incoming inquiry from alumni who are curious about how the Chicago tradition might be relevant to their particular fields. And the corporate sector has actually been one that stepped forward. And so just so folks who are on the live stream and others know, if you are a leader in the corporate sector and you're curious about how the Chicago tradition might be relevant for the organization you lead, please be in touch. We are interested in having conversations to facilitate that and developing longer-term plans. And finally, I'll say we're interested in working with students here in various ways. We mentioned the arts yesterday, but I failed to mention one particular thing we're proud of. There's a 90-year-old student-run initiative here called Doc Films. And this year, we have partnered with Doc Films to present a set of 8 government-censored from other governments over the course of history films preceded by conversations with academic experts in the particular regions and territories in which those films derive. We will continue to look for ways to support student activity here. And we are delighted to be partnering with Parousia on multiple fronts, including the Lab School Project. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend Tom Ginsberg, the faculty director of the Chicago Forum, to kick us off with Rising Illiberalisms.
Thank you so much, Tony. Appreciate it. There is first a housekeeping note. On the original program, my colleague and co-author Aziz Huq was listed. There's a lot going on in this building today, you may have noticed, people getting off at multiple floors. And one of the things is the Law School Council, Advisory Council, where Aziz is speaking this morning. So thanks to Amanda Williams for graciously agreeing to move to this panel. We're very excited to have this amazing group of people to discuss the issues of rising illiberalisms. The sense is that there's multiple illiberalisms that may feed on each other, and what we're going to do is explore the causes and consequences and maybe even the remedies there too. And so what I'd like to do first is just have each panelist introduce themselves, and then I'll ask a question, then we'll have a very open conversation followed by Q&A. So.
Yes, good morning, everyone. I'm Tracy Hall, Executive Director of the American Library Association.
And I'm Suzanne Nossel. I'm the CEO of PEN America. And if you don't mind, I'm going to take a 1-second point of personal privilege just to say, since we're doing a panel on rising illiberalisms, I woke up at 4 this morning to the news that Narges Mohammadi has been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize this year. We awarded her what we call the PEN Barbie Freedom to Write Award in May, and got to know her husband and her family and her closest supporters and have been telling her story. She's an incredibly courageous, dogged women's rights and human rights activist who's been in and out of prison in Iran for decades and been separated from her family and her now teenage children for more than 15 years. Just so really thrilled to celebrate this recognition for her and believe it will be a step forward for that movement against illiberalism in Iran.
I'm Amanda Williams. I'm a visual artist based here in Chicago.
I'm David French. I'm a Chicago law school dad. My daughter has been admitted and deferring, and my son-in-law just started. And I'm also a New York Times columnist.
Wonderful. Thank you. We like that introduction, the way of introducing yourself over at the law school. So I actually want to start with you, Tracy. So if you'd asked me 10 or 20 years ago, what's the chance that libraries would be at the front lines of the culture wars, I probably would have said there's not much chance of that. What's going on with your members and what's going on in libraries?
Yeah, well, I think that this is probably the third time that libraries or reading as a constitutional right has really been at the forefront of societal change and conflict, right? So, of course, we cannot not start with the Black Code laws, right? So when we think about going back to the period of enslavement, we see restrictions. In fact, one of the most punishable offenses is for Black people to be caught reading and for white people to be caught teaching someone to read, someone Black to read. And for white people, I think it's really interesting. It is one of the few Black Code laws that's punishable with not only jail time and fines, but also with corporal punishment. So, by 1867, you have Harper's Bazaar, a debate about Black people reading, and one of the people writing into the editor starts with this line: "The alphabet is an abolitionist." So I want to posit that because I think we forget, and then of course, we go on to thinking about libraries at the front lines of the conversation about un-American activities. When we think about Senator Joseph McCarthy, who's responsible for not only banning but burning also a total about 30,000 books, but who said, hey, I'm not creating any legislation, but he was creating a chilling effect around reading. And that's where we see librarians being caught up in that conversation, being fired from jobs, library trustees as well, being pushed out of those roles. And again, we see libraries on the front line. And in fact, Senator Joseph McCarthy's sort of reign was from about 1947 until 1954 when he died. Now, I'm not saying that librarians killed him, but we will say that in 1951, the American Library Association, along with AAP, the Publishers Association, met in New York for a reason, and that was to contest censorship. And in 1953 met again, and in 1953 created the Reader's Bill of Rights, which some believe was one of the most powerful tools. It was a playbook that was able to stand up to what was happening. And again, as I said, 1954, McCarthy has died. And also we see in the 2000s, and so glad Annette is on the panel. At the same time, we see the culture wars really looking at art and free expression. We also see libraries, and the first time we start seeing libraries really persecuted because of making available LGBTQIA material. And I was working at Seattle Public Library during that time, a very young, I was still in library school. I was still a student working in the library, but there we started to see groups of people organizing to come in and confiscate materials, and very much we see librarians and libraries on the front line of that conversation as well about LGBTQIA visibility. And I would have to say the American Library Association, even in 1966, was the first professional association to actually have representation in an early Pride parade. And so here we are today, right, where I would say that this is a McCarthy era on steroids, right, because we are able to see especially a lot of copy and paste legislation. And we see what's happening now, especially censorship and book banning, as sort of like a lightning rod conversation. I mean, I think libraries are necessarily on the front lines because libraries are the most visited public service institution in the U.S. Before the pandemic, over 1 billion visits, no restrictions on who can use them. We have more public libraries alone than we have in Donald's, right? So we're talking about ubiquity, we're talking about access. Libraries are the largest provider of access to the internet. And so I think for some, because libraries are so class, a lot of people who are wealthier don't use libraries as often, but people who tend to be who are less wealthy are super users of the library, might use a library between 1 and 3 times a week or more. And so I think there's a real class divide when we talk about libraries. And I think libraries, the conversation about libraries, it will not, because we must prevail in terms of knowledge access, but we are facing the same conversation at public education, where we've seen massive disinvestment in public education on the basis of both race and class. So it is no surprise to me and those of us who have worked in libraries or who are library stakeholders that this conversation would come to libraries and that the most challenged books would be books by and about LGBTQIA and BIPOC life and lived experiences. So it's not a surprise to me. It is here, and if you know anything about librarians and readers, we'll prevail for sure.
It's a tough group. My mother-in-law is one.
She did.
Yes, as you know. So, Suzanne, I wanted to ask you about a recent report put out by PEN, which, by the way, is one of my favorite organizations. I love PEN because you're a truly global organization doing all this important work. But the report that was called Booklash, because that also goes to books, but it goes to the publishing and sort of the step before libraries. Can you tell us a little bit about what that said and about illiberalism that you see there?
Yeah, sure. But the Booklash report, which we put out about 6 weeks ago, and you can find it on our website at pen.org. It's called Booklash, Literary Freedom, Online Outrage, and the Language of Harm. And for those of you who know PEN America, you know we have been alongside ALA right at the forefront of the campaign against book banning across the country, documenting meticulously book bans. We just put out our latest count of 3,362 books banned in the 2022-23 school year. We look at which states are doing the most banning, the legislative underpinnings of the banning. We're working with school systems and librarians across the country to push back, filing lawsuits. So we're doing all of that work. But we also, in the context of this Booklash report, took a look at a different but in some ways related phenomenon, which is when authors and publishers come under pressure to withdraw books from circulation, either before they're even published or sometimes, once they're out on the shelves, and for a few different reasons. Sometimes it's a question of whether the author had the authority or the right to cover the topic they were covering. Did they have the appropriate lived experience? Were they from a relevant racial group? And if not, sometimes those books have been called into question. The legitimacy, the right of those authors has been called into question. Publishers have come under pressure to pull back those books. In other cases, it has to do with the conduct of an author. An author has done something perhaps very reprehensible, or maybe just been accused of something that hasn't yet been proven. But the outrage that can mount online can lead to a decision to pull back a book. Sometimes it's the content of the book, and oftentimes in those cases, the book hasn't even necessarily been read. I mean, a recent book was announced that was set in revolutionary Russia, and a group of people identifying themselves online as Ukrainians said, well, why would you put out a book now about Russia? And the author felt such a thunderous sense of rage that she pulled the book back. Another example we talk about in the report is a children's book about Adolf Hitler. And this is a book by an award-winning author. And, the author and the editor and the publisher all thought this book would be edifying for children, that this is a story for various reasons that perhaps children should know about. They thought the content of the book was appropriate. It was sensitively presented and accurately presented. But they were so afraid of somebody somewhere getting upset about this book that they pulled it nonetheless. And, that to me is cancel culture. It's when you believe in something, everybody around you believes in something, but you think there's a culture out there that is telling you no. And just on the basis of that abstraction, you're so intimidated that you pull back on a set of ideas. And so we doubled down on the 1953 statement about the freedom to read. And that's really one of the centerpieces of this report, is that idea, which is at the heart of the movement to push back against book bans and against the notion that books are dangerous, that books are harmful, that we can't trust readers, that it should be in the hands of authorities to dictate what we can and can't pick up from a shelf. And that's what's wrong at the heart of the movement to ban books. And that's what's also wrong at the heart of this kind of literary movement to call out, criticize, deride, and insist that books be denied to readers. And, for us at PEN America, we get that some of this has to do with historic legacies of lack of diversity and inclusion in the publishing industry. And that's an issue that we've looked at as well. We published a report on that earlier this year. They're, in a sense, two sides of the same coin. Sometimes that sense of who's been excluded from the canon can lead to the questioning about who has the authority to cover particular topics. But I believe passionately that lowering the barriers to voice for some need not mean raising them anew for others. And that if what we have is a more competitive landscape where everybody has a chance to vie and to get their story told, that benefits readers. But if we're creating new rules about who's in and who's out, that is to the detriment of readers.
So, Amanda, I'm hoping you'll tell me that art is a realm in which free expression reigns supreme.
Of course, we're all sitting out plein air painting. This is fantastic to kind of be in dialogue with you all, to think about art, books in relationship to art, or reading, this idea of free speech in relation to art, both in the traditional sense, but also, at least for me lately, ideas about monuments and memorials. So we're seeing very pronounced at the same time, these things are all happening in parallel, that there's a kind of pushback on whose story gets to be told. And then you're seeing, especially during the pandemic, a kind of zero tolerance for anybody that does not want to maintain the story that kind of makes us believe that the form of democracy that we've been fed is the singular way. So this rise of a liberalism in the arts, in this kind of public sphere in particular, I think is very strong in terms of its parallel. I sat on the City of Chicago's Memorials and Monuments Committee, which was a 2-year convening where we looked at, I think, about 40 monuments that exist around the city and analyzed them for questions of what they call troubled stories. Then also stories that maybe should still stay in the sphere. Maybe it's Hitler, maybe it's Columbus. And then really thinking about what stories have never been told that need to be brought to the fore. So that kind of work is work that is in much the same light of paralleling, these ideas about where's the investment? What is the logic for why one would care one way or the other? What are we trying to say that we haven't been saying before? What do we need to be saying that hasn't been said before? But I think for me, I grew up in Auburn Gresham, but I went to the lab school. And so, I lived in a bubble where, my daughter's in middle school. They had a ban the banned books week. So she had her T-shirt, her granny bought her that said, life without books. Ha ha ha, that wouldn't exist. So they were reading out loud these books that have been banned all over the world. But, the first moments where I really understood that the idea of free speech or the idea to have inquiry was something that could be contested, oddly enough, in popular culture were kind of two moments that I just wanted to invoke as we have this conversation. One is an artist named Dred Scott, who was a student at the Art Institute of Chicago, and I think it was in the late 80s, said how the title of the piece was something like How to View the American Flag. and he had it on the floor. And George Bush derided this, right? So the idea that this art student who's trying to have this dialogue about these questions essentially becomes famous for this moment where he brings this conversation literally about free speech and what it means to be an American and a citizen into the forefront. And then oddly enough, the 2 Live crew. So when I was in college, there was a huge case about free speech that centered around maybe not the best art, depending on who, what your musical preferences are. But I thought it was very important to really be at the polarities or the edges of what might be deemed speech, art, expression. And so we're seeing that more and more as we grow impatient with each other. There's no desire for dialogue because everybody just wants their own point to be heard. And you really see that we're at the fringes now of what's been evolving forever, but definitely in terms of modern times in the last 30 years, with people just really entrenched in what they believe in and feeling like not only is that the right way, that's the only way. And so we're continuing to see that. And so now all of these storied, I'd say, what seemed like safe institutions or things that are not particularly controversial, we're seeing those come into the conversation as much as these categories that have always held a kind of contested weight. So I think artists are always seeking to be truth tellers. So as Tracy said, we're not going away. But I think the strength and the courage to not be guided by cancel culture is going to be huge. At least for me, I'm horrible at the internet, so I don't know when people are saying bad stuff about me, except for my kids. But I do think, I understand there's danger involved, but I do think that there's a courage that needs to be kind of re-injected into conversations about, if you believe in what you're talking about, then it actually kind of doesn't matter what other people are saying to some degree. That's easy to say when you're not getting death threats or someone's not in front of your home or threatening your families. But I think that that's the kind of the ethos we need to kind of tap into again. So excited to be part of this bigger conversation.
Terrific. David, I was going to ask you specifically about the realm of religion, which you write a lot about. And, you write a lot about illiberalism, rising illiberalism in the realm of religion. I wonder if you'd say a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think the very shorthand way of describing what's happening is, especially in white evangelical spaces and sort of this giant coalition, is that white evangelicalism has lost power and gained liberty and doesn't like that trade. Okay, so if I had to describe sort of the arc of my career, I spent many years before I was a writer. I was a lawyer. I was litigating free speech and religious liberty issues. And if you go back into the 90s and the early 2000s, there was a very relentless message, which was viewpoint neutrality from public institutions. Don't treat religion any better or worse than you treat other perspectives. And it was a very powerful message. In fact, it was so powerful that the winning streak on free speech and religious liberty on college campuses and in litigation inspired a famous song. I think this might be true, by DJ Khaled. All I do is win, win, win. But I don't know. Don't fact check that. But so there was just this incredible win streak that is continuing in courts for free speech and religious liberty. I think it's been 13 years now since there's been a significant religious liberty loss at the Supreme Court. So right now in the United States of America, you, regardless of your faith, regardless of your point of view, have more freedom from government censorship of your speech, whether it's secular or religious, than at any point in American history. It's a tremendous legal victory. And yet you do not see large sections of the Christian community in the United States celebrating that victory. Instead, there's a rising anger. And there's a rising anger at what? The expression of others. And so the library circumstance is a classic example of this. So a huge free speech argument got kicked off on the right over this thing called drag queen story hours in libraries. And I've been involved in debating this for years now. I never thought that a big chunk of my public voice would be about defending the free expression of drag queens. I never had that in my bingo card. But there it is. And I remember sitting there in a debate at Catholic University where saying, well, what do you want to do about this? And the answer was sort of twofold. One was to completely alter First Amendment jurisprudence to remove viewpoint neutrality so that the government could target specific kinds of expression that it didn't like. And then the other one was like this performative thing where I believe the statement was, well, then I'd call the head of like the American Library Association or whatever in front of the Senate and have Josh Hawley grill them. And I thought, well, if, you know the librarians I've known, I feel sorry for Josh Hawley. But there is this real sense, and a lot of this is rooted in animosity and fear. And there is this real sense that if I allow people to speak who share viewpoints that I dislike or find abhorrent, that some people might believe it, right? And they might agree with it, and they might change their mind and adapt viewpoints that I don't like. And it is very difficult to defend free speech in an atmosphere of extreme animosity. It is very difficult. And many times what you have to do before you can even start to convince someone of the value of free speech is you have to penetrate through that animosity. And it is a very, very difficult thing to do. And there's also rising in parts of the religious right this idea that free speech is antithetical to morality. And that is also something that has to be dealt with. And one of the things that I do when I go and I speak in front of religious audiences is I bring up Frederick Douglass's powerful plea for free speech in Boston in 1860. It's probably the best short statement in favor of free speech I've ever read in my life. It's very short. You can read it. You know how on newspapers it will say, here's a column, 3-minute read. This might be a 2-minute read. It'd be incredibly valuable 2 minutes because it has some lines in there that are potent and true. And one of the most important is Douglass said, looking at a nation awash in profound injustice, he said, free speech is the great moral renovator of society and government. It is the freedom that tyrants dread the most. And if you look at the history of the United States of America, free speech, a lot of people don't really realize this. Doctrines of free speech did not bind the states and the local governments until the incorporation of the First Amendment, not to use a legal term of art, but the incorporation of the First Amendment to the states and local governments in the early 20th century. And I'm not going to say that free speech was the single thing that revolutionized American conceptions of justice, but America is unquestionably a more just place to live in 2023 than in 1923. Unquestionably, who wants to go back to I shouldn't use that. More people than I thought want to go back to 1923, but really, truly, who wants to go back to, say, a 1923? And I'll leave with this. I had a conversation years ago with the Reverend Walter Fauntroy, who was a powerful figure in the civil rights movement and instrumental in founding the Congressional Black Caucus. And I remember sitting with him and asking, okay, there was hundreds of years of legalized oppression defended by violence in the United States of America. And then between 1950, Brown v. Board and the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act was 10 to 12 years of remarkable legal change. Did not fix everything, but it was a remarkable legal change. And I remember asking him, what did he attribute this to? And he had this fantastic answer that has stuck with me for more than 20 years. He said, Almighty God and the First Amendment. And he said, the First Amendment gave us the ability to speak, and Almighty God softened men's hearts. And I thought that was a phenomenal answer. And I feel like this is a call for our time. There's a legal call and there's a cultural call. The legal call is to continue to defend the regime of liberty. The cultural call is to open our hearts. And why should we open our hearts in a time when we hate each other so much? Well, the American experiment is built around these sort of two core ideas about human beings. One is we are people of incalculable worth. Each one of us is of incalculable worth. So why wouldn't you want to defend the freedom of someone of incalculable worth or hear from them? Why wouldn't you want to hear from them? And the other one is we're all imperfect and fallen and flawed. And so why would any one of us think that we can decide what is the true and right speech for everyone else? We're far too flawed for that. We're far too imperfect. And what's important is those two concepts resonate in American religious tradition, in Christian, it's basic Christian theology, for example, both our worth and our flaws. It's basic Christian theology. And I really feel like we have to go back to first principles with America's religious community and talk about these basic principles to rebuild a culture of free speech that is frankly ebbing away.
Well, there's so much there and everything you've said, all of you. I guess the question I want to ask the panel is about causes. We tend to think of liberalism as being an idea that the public sphere is basically neutral, a neutral zone in which we contest through expression and such, and morality is private. And something seems to be going on where that's collapsing, where, my private morality must be imposed and such and so. And why is this going on? I might start with Suzanne, actually.
Look, I see three kind of strands. I think on the left, sort of the unfinished business of becoming a more equitable and inclusive society and kind of reckoning with that which got done and that which didn't get done and that which is stagnating and the pushback that remains and how insidious it is. I think, once you've achieved sort of formal equality and you have equal wages and you can't discriminate in employment, but prejudice and discrimination persist, you sort of unavoidably have to go to this realm of language and belief and how we relate to each other and how we talk to each other and what thoughts are coursing through people's heads. And that sort of touches on speech and expression. It touches on what the tone and tenor is around a dining table or in a classroom. Mm-hmm. And, we have to kind of come to grips with that. I think, one notion that has taken hold is that sort of free speech is incompatible with DEI, to kind of oversimplify that. To really achieve an equitable and inclusive campus, sort of some people have to, and some viewpoints have to be silenced because those viewpoints can interfere with other people's sense of belonging, sense of being able to articulate their own voice. So I think that's happening kind of coming from the left. Coming from the right, I think it's sort of two strains. I think part of it is kind of an interplay with that, where there's a sense that the campus has become so captive, and not just the campus, the media, publishing had become so captive sort of to the left that at any cost, the conservatives are justified in pushing back, that threat of liberal orthodoxy is so powerful that if you have to trammel free expression rights and ban drag shows to sort of yank things backward, that is justified in the name of trying to wrest control from these forces that this flank of people see as undermining to their position, their identity, their own voice. I think there's a second strand on the right that is genuinely authoritarian, that doesn't even recognize that it's a trade-off, that is buying into the playbooks of the Orbans and Putins around the world and, doesn't actually believe in the First Amendment. And then, the final thing I think we have to put on the table is sort of liberalism's own failure, I think, to better articulate how the values of equality and free speech can and must coexist. And for PEN America, this is really, we really try to put this at the heart of our work. It's at the heart of my book, Dare to Speak, which is 20 principles for how we can live together in our diverse, digitized, and divided society without curbing free speech. And there's, it requires a lot. It's not as simple, frankly, even as the Chicago Principles. I think the Chicago Principles are terrific, but they don't really talk about how to reconcile these competing tensions within the university that I think are, at the heart and soul of what you're going to be dealing with as a center here. And, what it means for free speech rights to take that on. I talk about things like conscientiousness with language, that, yes, you should speak your mind, but you should be aware of how your words are going to land, of how people want to be described, of who's in your audience and the fact that they may not all share your assumptions or your background, and that as a speaker, you have a duty of care to take that into account. And also, by the way, if you do so, you're going to be more effective. You're going to be more persuasive. There's less of a chance that people are going to get their hackles up and reject what you have to say because you've offended them or you've used the wrong terminology. You actually stand a better chance of breaking through and having a genuine, persuasive give and take. I talk about acknowledging power relations as they affect speech. You know, that is part of the package in a classroom. And to sort of deny it and not reckon with it, I think doesn't create the kind of open marketplace for ideas. If some people feel constrained by virtue of their background, their race, their gender, their socioeconomic status, and don't feel like they can have a voice, then the marketplace for ideas is impoverished. Their voices are missing. And so we have to attend to not just the restraints on free expression, but the enablers of expression. So at Penn, we have programs for incarcerated writers so they can get their voices into public discourse, for young undocumented students so that they can learn to write and be part of our public conversation. And we see that as part and parcel of free speech work, that if, by bringing in those voices, we are contributing to an atmosphere of free speech and to a robust and wide exchange.
Fantastic. Anyone else on causes? Like, what is driving this?
One thing I would say is we have to recognize that liberalism, and especially a liberalism that really platforms and highlights free speech, is not the norm in human society. And one of the reasons why it's not the norm in human society is in many ways it cuts against our human nature. It cuts against our will to power, our confidence in our own self and our own ideas and our own movements and our own ideologies. And it's also not utopian. I have had a lot of free speech debates in my career, and when I'm debating somebody who really wants to restrict free speech, many times what I'm debating is somebody who has a utopian view, and I've got the more grubby view. That you're gonna have to hear some stuff you don't like, and that might really be bad. And that is a tough sell when someone is saying everything you like about dialogue, I can promise I'll retain, and everything you don't like about dialogue, I can eliminate all of the mess. Right? It's sort of like saying I can have an industrial economy and zero pollution. Oh, that's cool. How are you going to do that? But so in many ways, liberalism writ large, I like the way the pseudonymous writer Scott Alexander described it. It was imperfectly born out of the savagery of the wars of religion. And he called it this alien technology engineered for avoiding civil war. How do you live together across immense differences without quite literally shooting each other? I mean, it really does get to, if you look at the sweep of human history, it really does get that basic. And so one of the disadvantages is that liberalism has is it's not actually a utopian movement at all. In many ways, it's quite accommodationist to even people or ideas that you find reprehensible. And that's a hard sell. It is a hard sell. And that's why you have to, I go back again and again to this notion of our own imperfection, our own flaws, our own misunderstandings. And I love the John Stuart Mill argument where he says, look, if you, let's say I'm wrong and you're right, and you speak to me and you convince me that I'm wrong. Well, free speech has benefited me because you've taken me from error into truth. Maybe kicking and screaming, by the way, but you've taken me from error into truth. But let's suppose you and I have a conversation. At the end of it, I still think you're wrong, and you still think I'm wrong. What have I gained from that? Maybe it's been painful. What have I gained from that? Well, I've gained a lot, actually. I know you better. I understand your viewpoint better. I've sharpened my own understanding of my viewpoint because you've tested its weaknesses. I've come from that with hopefully a relationship which has real value and a better understanding of not just you, but of me as well. And that's a value, and it's sometimes of painful value. I don't want to sugarcoat it. I'm not going to be utopian, which is why I really like what you're saying about our own responsibilities as we're speakers. model the values you seek to advance. With the right to speak comes the responsibility to speak well. And there's nothing wrong with asking people to exercise their right to speak responsibly. There's nothing wrong with that. And I do think that we need to carry with us as we go into the public square both our rights and our responsibilities.
I know you have more questions, and that's why I'm so ask your next.
Okay, so this is my next question for the whole panel, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. The next question is, obviously it's an extremely tough time. Liberalism's feeding on each other, existential questions for humanity. Is there anything out there that gives you hope? What do you see that it makes you sort of think, okay, we're going to be okay? Or what is it? What are the seeds out there? And I'll start with you, Tracy.
Okay, I'm always hopeful, but I want to say if we're going to sound like a non sequitur, I'm going to go back a little bit to a couple of things. Well, one thing I will start with what gives me hope is like when we think about free expression is just, especially thinking about information and information theory, is that the first thing that you learn when you sit down in library school, like day one, second one, is that information wants to be free. It is in the nature of information to find an audience. That's just the nature. And so when I say that we will prevail, it is because in all societies, when information has been pushed, when access to knowledge has been pushed underground, people have found a way to preserve it and to disseminate it. And we will continue. Although I don't want us to push ourselves into a space where we don't have places like libraries or places in the university where we can not only have access, but debate those ideas. But I wanted to go back to something that I'm thinking that you were saying that, and the reason why I just thought about this is because I do think, I love being, how you get on a panel and then you really want to just be in the audience because you want to just be writing all the notes. This is one I feel that way. Number one is that intellectual freedom and diversity, equity, inclusion have to be mutually reinforcing principles. If they are not, we are doing them both. We're doing both wrong. That's the tag. It's like for me when I'm writing or making anything, if it is not simple, then I know that it isn't wrong because the way that I see it is crystal clear, and my job is to make it crystal clear to whoever is going to receive it. So I just want to say that because, and the reason why I wanted to kind of go in that order is because when you were talking about this notion of being responsible and speaking, that's at the crux of the conversation. That feels to some people like a new control on them, where it has always been a way of life for others, right? And I say that because one of my best friends, and not my play best friend, or like somebody I just know and I'm saying best friend for, super effect here, but one of my like real best friends, known since 17. We are one of the closest friends, middle of the night, 3 a.m. friend. We believe actually was responsible for writing the math book in Florida that was banned. She's a leading, Dr. Nikki Newton, one of the leading math pedagogists. And the reason why the book was banned is because it coming out of Columbia Teachers College. So in addition to learning the thing, is how do you teach the thing, right? And it is this notion of allowing people to arrive at math at their own pace and having other people, allowing them the process of thinking and deduction. Because how math class, it's this, and then the people who are not there yet, they never put their hand up. And then the fear of math, or I don't do math well, calcifies. And so the reason why DeSantis and others banned this book is because there's a column, 3 times 5 is 15, but students will learn how to describe how they deduce the answer, and other students will learn to wait until some of the slower students also have that opportunity. So you get a chance to answer, but we don't move on now that you've answered. We wait to see if Trinity can get to that place, and we also wait to allow her the opportunity to process. That was seen as dangerous, and to make the person who puts their hand up first feel bad. But we live in a society where the person who gets there slower, it's okay if they feel bad, but the person who arrives there first, or who just feels like I can say it's 17 and not be penalized because I'm smart. And why am I smart? Because I have been assigned a sense of smartness. And some of you feel me, but the thing that I'm really trying to say is that I really feel like the other thing that we have to talk about in this conversation is privilege. Who has the opportunity for a certain type of freedom of speech, and who is penalized if they say, and I guess what I'm trying to get to is that information wants to be free. We want to create a society where, and you think, I'm going to stop there and just think about something that Representative John Lewis, who I think is one of the great crusaders around free speech. One of the things that he said and he predicted before he passed away is that he believed that access to information, to the internet, and access to information more broadly would be the civil rights issue of the 21st century. And he saw exactly where we were going to be. But I think we have to have conversations about also to the segregation that has existed, and that we don't have free spaces, safe places to disagree. And in fact, how we perfect our knowledge is in that space where we are able to disagree and maybe be proselytized and see a new point of view. But I want to kind of end with something, because I was just in Rotterdam for the International Federation of Library Association. And, when you get to Rotterdam, you're in Erasmus territory, right? And he's saying, life without book is unlivable. And you're thinking about the way in which Rotterdam, in a lot of ways, has been constructed, and even thinks of itself today, contemporarily, as a place where there should be this free exchange of ideas, even ideas in conflict. And it makes me think about the prescience of this forum. And here I just want to commend the university. I'm not doing that hollowly, but I'm doing that because I think that this new forum and this opportunity is right on time. And I want to read to you what you already know, but in light of this mission here, the mission of the American Library Association at the end is to enhance learning and provide information access to all. And as executive director, I don't think I've ever worked with an organization or for an organization, this is my second time at ALA, that has had a more incredible mission. But today, I just want to read this from the University of Chicago. Let knowledge grow from more to more. Let knowledge grow from more to more, and so be human life enriched. And I just think about that, because I think that is the project. That is actually the project of our democracy, to let knowledge grow from more to more and to resist the urge to silence that which is uncomfortable.
Great. Well, who can go after that?
What gives you hope? I'll go back to that.
Man.
Yeah.
So many things. I think, just to piggyback off of that, I think that, this idea of that responsibility, let knowledge grow from more to more. I think my husband's favorite word lately is soft. He's always complaining that his kids are soft, these teens are soft, everything's, are you crying at that commercial? You're soft. No, but I think there's a way in which we can hold on to a security blanket of a time in which we all felt we had this kind of grit. Or so I'm thinking of Chicagoans in particular, or the kind of narrative of what Chicago is, the city of big shoulders, the second city, and Grabowski, and all of these kinds of things. And with that, though, I think there's also a fear of a kind of vulnerability and a patience and a grace. So this idea of a safe space for these things. But I think that I found, not only as part of the university community for so long, but other institutions that I've been a part of, that it's easy to kind of put your blinders on about your responsibility to operate outside of your own best self-interest. Like, how do you really do that? And so how can you grow from more to more when, how many brown people are in this audience, right? How many people really have, there's a wealth of diversities that we share in this audience. And there are 100 people that I'm going to have a connection to. I'm waving. But then there's also like an absence of people that live 3 blocks away. They have no expectations. They have any relationship to this place. And that is their relationship to this place. And so I think that it's incumbent upon us, with responsibility, with the idea of inquiry, with the idea of liberalism, that, sometimes I feel like it's a little bit of a selling of a bill of goods, when it's like, well, it's easy to be liberal when everybody looks like you. Like, Colorado is great. It's like, but what happens when you have to contend with difference and that you might end with still being different. Like that used to be fun. That was called like a Bears game. No, that was like, we still lost. So I think that there's a way in which we have to think through what are these forums of safety in which the answer is not feeling good at the end, or softness, as my husband would call it. I did a project very quickly. I'm going to toss this in there because it's just floating in my head as I'm trying to make sense of all these great comments. For the Museum of Modern Art during the pandemic, there's already an unreasonable request, right? Can you make a work of art about how we'll exist in public post-pandemic for the museum right now, but we might not be open by the time we finish this piece? Sure, why? Yeah. So I create this work called Embodied Sensations, and it's touching exactly on what Tracy's talking about. It's like, I'm confused about why so many people are upset that they can't go to the bar. It's like, what are you talking about? There are people that I know that have never been able to be included in these types of spaces. And so what we did was write this kind of script in which we asked people what seemed like very simple questions, and then we gave 4 different voices to the answers. And then you could choose online what these answers were. So an example would be, how much space do you need? Now remember, this is like October 2020. So you are tired of everyone you are related to at this moment. It's like, how much space do you need? Just my bedroom, the square of a Zoom window, a prison cell. We happen to have a summer home in Maine. So this range of what people believe space is and what they are afforded comes to the forefront. And then we translate these into movements that people are going to be able to do. So we create this choreography, this ballet that happens in the MoMA's atrium, which is what they believe is their commons or their public space, which is already a little bit funny to me because it's like, well, who's coming inside a MoMA? Is it everybody? I'm not sure about that. But within this forum, you could sign up. These instructions would be placed on the wall to do these movements that were related to these answers. And so the hope was really that these people serendipitously would come together, and because they've been apart for so long, they kind of didn't care who else was there. And so my favorite was one that says, maintain 6 feet of distance from everyone else. And so oddly enough, in order to do that, people had to kind of touch and then come together. So then they started doing this funny little dance where each time people serendipitously would perform, would create some kind of ring or circle where they're trying to like reach for each other, but not. And it was like, I couldn't have imagined that in these crazy little rules that I was making up for people to perform. But literally tears come to your eyes when you see that people inherently in these moments, right, there's something about it that wants to come together when we're not first having to ask each other what political party we belong to or what religion we are or what, right? But at the end of the day, it really did continue to reinforce an idea about how we're going to have to negotiate getting along. But that was a little moment of hope that I did not expect to have or to see. That really brings to the fore our responsibilities to one another at a very fundamental human level. Most days I'm not so sure it's possible, but in these moments, these isolated moments of society and these ebbs and flows where we see our similarities, I think those are those moments that we as scholars, as thinkers, as makers should capitalize on to remind people, right? And maybe use that as the kernel, to revitalize ourselves, really.
Thank you. David and Suzanne, if you can throw something out there quickly that gives you hope. First, yeah. David.
One thing that gives me hope is a single concept that I have seen not just defend free speech, but heal breaches, deep breaches between people. And I call it the legal corollary to the golden rule, which is defend the rights of others that you would like to exercise yourself. And the people who practice that as a life, this very small group of, for example, truly consistent First Amendment defenders who defend all, sort of all comers. I have noticed in many of these people just a really profound understanding and empathy, because to defend someone's liberty requires understanding their perspective. Mm-hmm. And you don't have to be a lawyer to do that. If you see somebody who is under fire unjustly, even just reaching out to them or making a simple statement on a Facebook page or whatever, just the act of extending yourself to defend someone you don't agree with who is under unfair attack and having their liberty taken from them in an unfair way, to me, as a transformative experience. And I have seen it transform people and communities when they do that. So that one simple concept I've seen work both legal change and heart level change.
I mean, I'll build on that, and I see some hope in the fact that kind of in our public discourse right now, the way these debates are playing out, it becomes so much harder for either side to sort of deny these fundamentals. Whereas, some on the left would have said, we need to curb free speech because of hateful speech and attitudes. Now they're witnessing how, that principle has just been turned around to suppress drag shows and books about LGBTQ identity and, slavery and racial justice and all of these themes that they feel need to be put forward, but that other people have labeled as dangerous. And so, and then on the right, they want to suppress the drag show, but God forbid, you should suppress dialogue about these complex issues with trans identity and whether it's trans in sports or, trans youth and how the medical establishment should react to that. They feel that must be a debate that cannot be suppressed. You can't, put that down in the name of preserving identity or, label it as, a form of transphobia or hate speech. And so, if there's any reason left, I feel like both sides, would begin to come together and say, aha, really what David is saying, that, and that's one of the principles of my book as well, is that it's not just about being conscientious and absorbing your duty of care as a speaker. You also have to defend controversial speech and speech you disagree with, that there are an interlocking set of obligations that we all have if we were going to make what Tracy underscored a reality, which is that these principles of equality and free speech must coexist. They must be mutually reinforcing. But that requires a lot of us. You can't just sort of posit that. We actually each have to, in our lives, in our discourse, we have to live that. We have to spell out the principles. We have to teach our students, what that means in practice. We have to practice time and again. And so, my hope is this ends up being a moment of enlightenment, kind of the juxtaposition of the forces on the right and the left, are forced to kind of have an aha moment where they see, that there is this larger truth.
Wonderful. We have some time for questions, and so please raise your hands and I'll call on you. And just wait, if you would, until the microphone arrives to you. Raise your hand so they can give you the mic. There we are.
Hi, everyone. So for the past year, I was working for a nonprofit that served queer youth in schools. So the question of age appropriateness or developmental relevance was always at the forefront of the work that we were doing. So my question for each of you, in your spaces, how are we defining what is age appropriate or developmentally relevant for young people, elementary age, middle school age, high school age? And what are the factors that determine that?
Tracy, that seems direct.
Definitely. Thank you. That's a great question. I think, first of all, understanding that a lot of the books that are being challenged right now, especially, are Builder's Roman books, right? Not coming of age. A lot of people, are tracking that. And a lot of the books that are being challenged also, because of that, are YA, young adult, or tween, or older children. And often feature characters who are children, young adult. And so when we think about this notion of age appropriateness, I think that there is a misunderstanding basically of the actual book themselves. People, a lot of the people who are challenging books aren't reading them, right? Ray Bradbury, I think also predicted that when he said, the problem isn't censorship. The problem is a chilling effect, basically, and I'm paraphrasing, on the right to read, that people are not reading. And I would say, having attended more hearings than I would like in which books are being challenged or censored or restricted, there is a common refrain. When the person challenging them gets up to speak, I'm almost like saying it in my mind, I haven't read the book, Clint. And so what we know is that people are being persuaded and proselytized into censoring books that they haven't read. So to your question about age appropriateness, also we know that in terms of collection development protocols in libraries and in schools, people aren't just saying, oh, I like the book or I heard about the book. People are reading the book. What is the reading level? Who is the protagonist? What issues are they going through? And is that age appropriate? Is that something that a 12-year-old, like you think about Judy Blume, Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. Why was it challenged? One, it was challenged because of the ideation about religion, religious identity. And also challenged because of conversations about puberty and specifically about menstruation in a frank way that normalized it. But the character is also a young woman who is experiencing these things, and it's age appropriate. So sometimes it's not a blanket. I like to sort of think about what book is being challenged, because many of the books that are being challenged as not being age appropriate are indeed age appropriate. And so I think that the conversation about age appropriateness sometimes is just a tactic to restrict and challenge books. Because like I said, someone who is a librarian, hadn't done collective development, and started off in young adult and children's services, the books that are when I look at a book being challenged, I ask that question. So I haven't seen yet a book being challenged on the basis of not being age appropriate that is indeed not age appropriate.
Professor Schwader, the mic.
I'd like to focus on the library issue, and in particular, following up on this, on public school libraries, middle school and high school. And my question is, there are a lot of things published every year. Not a tiny percent of them are going to end up in a library at any school. Who do you think should be making that decision about what's in that library? Some people argue it should be the local school board, which would respect moral pluralism and recognize that you have forced parents to send their kids to that school, and they want to have some control over what their kids are learning. And there's a lot of diversity in this society about values, about family life, about gender. Why not let the local school board make that decision? Or do you want the state to appoint a bureaucracy in which you require that they read every one of those books, and then they make a decision, and the state essentially decides what children in public schools are going to be reading? Do you want it to be the librarian? Who do you want it to be? And it seems to me you have to answer that question. And that question is a very difficult one. I recommend highly a 1982 Supreme Court case called Island Trees School District versus PICO, in which a local school board got a hit list of bad books from a conservative organization. They went to their library and they removed a number of those books, and that ended up being contested. And our Supreme Court, at that time someone recused themselves, there was 8 people on the court, divided all over the place on what the principles should be that are operating here. And it's unresolved to this day because ultimately it never went to trial. We can't pretend that every book is age appropriate. Let's assume people actually do read them, okay, and decide they're age appropriate, and you disagree. You think they're age appropriate. Is liberalism actually a morally pluralistic system, or is liberalism basically think, this is what I want taught everywhere in the world? Okay, that's my question.
Yeah. Rick, thanks.
Can I talk about PICO for a minute?
Yeah.
Okay, so the case, the plurality, so there was a plurality opinion that ultimately governed the outcome of the case. And the plurality opinion, I think, established some principles that are quite solid. And so one of the principles is, of course, you can't have every library isn't Widener Library, right, at Harvard with millions of volumes. So there has to be a decision maker. And there's that decision maker, it can be a school board or it could be the librarian, given the academic freedom, which is actually my preference. If you give the librarian the academic freedom to decide on the collection. But there's going to be exclusive determinations. However, there's guardrails. There's a principle and then there's a guardrail. So here's the principle. One of the core purposes of education is to prepare students to live in a pluralistic, often contentious society. Okay? That is so important. Prepare students to live in a pluralistic, often contentious society. So if your book decisions are designed to drain the pluralism from the place and drain the contention from the place, you're violating the sort of core principle of what education is. So that's very powerful. Then the other thing is, it said, okay, you've got freedom to make curricular decisions, but here are the guardrails. You can't engage in systematic viewpoint discrimination. You can't say no books by Black authors, no books by Republican authors, no books. You can't engage. Why? And this is really interesting, because the students themselves have a right to receive information. They have a constitutional right to receive information. Now, I know this is a room full of con law scholars, and you're going to say, okay, David, but that was the plurality. It wasn't the controlling majority. I get it. I understand that, but I think the reasoning there is very sound. Very sound. It wasn't fleshed out as precisely as it needed to be, because you're right. The case was, which is exactly what I said. I said the principle is very sound, and I think it should be the governing principle going forward. I do believe that there is actually a right to receive information that exists. It is not unlimited. It has never been the case, for example, that children have access to pornography, right? It is not unlimited, but there is a fundamental right to receive information. And I think that plurality opinion in PICO is a very solid way of looking at it, and it's also a very persuasive way of looking at it. I've been involved in some of these book banning discussions, and I've articulated those principles, and the people involved in the decision-making have found them very helpful. I'm a big believer in that plurality opinion in PICO.
I'm just going to jump in. I was going to answer with a very silly answer before, but I'm intrigued now with what you said when you were asking about age appropriateness. And I was actually going to say, if you're over 20, you're not allowed to be in the space that you have to deal with these young people in, because I think I'm learning as a parent that my kids are way ahead of where I was on the world, let alone things I hadn't thought about by the time I was 10, 11, 12 years old. And I can remember my mother saying that she and my father had decided that if I was old enough to ask the question, they were courageous enough to answer it. And so that sounded good when we were born, but it was very uncomfortable when we were asking questions sooner than they were ready for, or questions that they would never dare ask their parents. And I feel like we're in that moment again on steroids. So, my kid said, oh, it's Pride Month. So my husband said, well, what are all the colors in the flag? And they went through them. And then we were like, oh, well, I didn't really know the colors had different. Okay, right. So it was like this moment in which we're being taught by them, but also this moment we had to decide what age appropriateness means in terms of what they should be exposed to, because the initial moment is fear. Like, why do they know that? Where did they get that information? Who gave it to them if it wasn't me? I thought I was protecting them by not talking about things that I thought they weren't ready for. And then they actually have received all the information and understand it maybe better than me. So then when you start talking about these kinds of foundational principles about what we're supposed to base these decisions upon, yes, law is one of them, but are there any child developmental psychologists in here? Because to me, age appropriateness is my almost 13-year-old thinks that Santa still exists and the 10-year-old doesn't. So which one is appropriate, right? And so I have to take in all of these lenses when I'm trying to make these decisions. This is just being a parent. Never mind teaching, never mind dealing with other people's kids. So I think it's also important that we mix all of these lenses to come to some kind of understanding and consensus about who should be involved in making these decisions. So while I think it's interesting and is going to be an age-old debate about whether it should be government or a kind of local entity, if you live in a city where the schools aren't equally resourced, then who should be making the decisions? The LSC on 89th and Walcott, has anybody been to that school? Or should it be Disney Magnet, right? That's going to be largely different kinds of conversations about what those books should be and the power that's inherent in these kind of LSCs or these local school councils and these boards. So I think that these cases are really important to kind of, help push what these foundational components are going to be, and then really, hold the feet to the fire again, of the rest of us to have that responsibility about how are we helping those of us within even the same zip codes understand how these decisions should be getting made, because it is the far left and the far right, right? So every book at Mollison, which is our CPS school down the street from us, is a brown author because the kids have never seen that. But then they don't know principles about pluralism. Maybe they don't even know what that word means, right? And so where is it from both sides? Not just the sides where you're afraid and you want to ban the things, but also from the sides where you're so excited to just show somebody what they look like that you're leaving out all the other conversations so that we don't have the plurality, we don't have the contested components of the society on both ends. It's not just the one that seems to be, au courant as the thing to attack, right?
And one quick thing on this phrase, age appropriate, it's not a self-defining term, okay? Just like hate speech, it's not a self-defining term. And so what I have seen locally is people saying it's not age appropriate to teach to have elementary school children exposed to images of genitalia. I would agree with that. But we also had Moms for Liberty saying that it was not age appropriate to teach elementary school kids in our local school district the book Ruby Bridges Goes to School. It was not age appropriate for elementary age kids in my school district to see the Norman Rockwell painting, the thing we all live with, about Ruby Bridges desegregating. So whenever I hear the words age appropriate, my first response is define it.
I mean, I just want to build on something Amanda said. I was talking to my daughter the other day, suggesting she write an email to someone. She said, "Mom, it's like cultural competence. You need generational competence. You need to understand why what you're suggesting I write is all wrong." And I think that's actually a lot of what's going on. I mean, you sort of imagine these school boards, and yet, yes, there's an interpretation of the law that says they should be empowered. But if they don't have the perspective of the rising generation that is sitting in these seats, in these classrooms, I mean, something we heard, I know Tracy has heard again and again, is how for some students, those books that may be very explicit, you could look at, some people will be shocked by, the images, the drawings in these books. They deal with puberty, adolescents who are coming of age, who are exploring their sexuality. But for some kids, they're lifesavers. And we've heard that from librarians and for teachers, for kids who are isolated, who don't have the support of their families, their communities, who are exploring an identity that is foreign and really feel like there's no path for them in the world and that they're going to be forever shunned and ostracized, that these books actually are life-saving. And so I think we do have to, I feel like the generational divide is spreading because of technology moving so quickly. And it really is, it's part of our job. No matter where you are in these debates, whether you're in the school system, a teacher, a principal, a librarian, you have to delve into this. It's not just a matter of your sensibilities sitting around that table with a bunch of adults that ought to dictate what kids can and can't read.
If you're like me, you'd love to listen to this conversation for the next 6 hours, but unfortunately we're out of time. So I want you to join me in thanking these panelists.
This is great.
And we're going to start the next panel in 15 minutes in the room.